Hey, welcome back to Maybe Actually Museums Are For Me. I'm Alex, host of this podcast, and I'm so glad that you're joining me for a very special episode of the show. Today, well, really this whole month, we're celebrating here at the Montclair Art Museum the birthday of the remarkable, incredibly influential, locally, beloved landscape artist, George Inness. Inness, often known as the father of American landscape painting, by some, is just a really remarkable artist who was influenced by the Hudson River School and spent the final years of his life here in Montclair, living and painting and working, and his impact is still felt to this day. George Inness has his name on buildings all around Montclair, including the public school district. Obviously, here at the Montclair Art Museum, we are beyond proud to own and show arguably the most robust and prolific collection of his work. George Inness is somebody that is collected widely amongst all of the major institutions all across the world. I've seen Inness's work personally in DC. I've seen it in Louisiana. I know it's in Rhode Island. Obviously, it's here at Montclair. I've seen it on view at the Met. George Inness is right up there with the likes of, say, Homer, or even, I think in this episode, I equate some of the work to, the landscapes of John Singer Sargent. What I'm trying to get at is Inness is a prolific artist who sometimes, I think, doesn't get the flowers he deserves. And maybe that's because I don't necessarily have the same, art history background that a lot of, people who may be listening to this and going, no, I love George Inness, of course. Who doesn't include Inness in that conversation? But from what I've observed and now living in Montclair for a few years, I think that it is an interesting topic, because I think we here, especially in this community, know who he is, know that he was important, but sometimes I don't think understand the complex impact of his work and what it really means to the art world, beyond. With that said, Inness was born on May 1st. If you're listening to this on release day, it is currently April 30th, 2025. Tomorrow is the 200th birthday of George Inness, and to celebrate this whole sort of month of Inness, the museum's doing a lot of programming, but in regards to this show, expect obviously this conversation to come with our chief curator, Gail Stavitsky, as we talk about the actual art of Inness. With all of that said, I think it is the perfect opportunity to sit down again with Gail Stavitsky, the chief curator here at the Montclair Art Museum, to talk in depth about the work of George Inness. Happy birthday, George. Hi, Gail.
Hi, Alex.
We're doing it again. Thank you so much for coming back on the podcast. I always love having you on because it's just always fun picking your brain about everything. And I'm very excited about this episode because it's airing the day before George Inness's birthday, which is a big deal. It's 200 years of George Inness, which is kind of crazy.
Yeah, well, we can never get enough of George Inness.
It seems that way. George Inness, I think locally, is a very known figure. Obviously, his name is on one of the schools. He has definitely become almost like I would say like a historical legend of the town. But for, people who may not be incredibly familiar with George Inness and his work and, his connection to Montclair, and just in very broad strokes, who is George Inness?
George Inness is regarded as one of America's greatest landscape painters, and he had a long time association with Montclair because he spent the last 9 years of his life in Montclair, and many of his paintings are inspired by Montclair, although they're not necessarily literal depictions of Montclair. they're poetic interpretations.
Yeah, when you had told me, or not told me directly, but we did a lot of work over this winter working with Native American collaborators on this revitalization, reimagining, if you will, of the George Inness show that will be coming very soon in correlation with his 200th birthday. When you had mentioned that these aren't actual depictions of the landscapes in Montclair, but these more interpretations and almost like spiritual, and I don't mean that pun intended, but yeah, spiritual kind of, I guess, depictions of the land. It was interesting to know that they weren't direct translations.
Right. I mean, that was really one of the most innovative aspects of George Inness's work, that he wasn't aiming for literal recreations of particular scenes, but rather he was expressing his deep feelings and spiritual engagement with nature, or the poetry of nature. So, I mean, very much, of course, inspired by developments in modern art. He traveled in France, for example, and saw the work of the French Barbizon artists like Corot and Daubigny. But still, I think very early on, he found his own voice.
Yeah. How did Inness find his way to Montclair? Because obviously he was a part of the Hudson River School, painted obviously all over the Northeast. He's obviously from works that we have on view in Italy. Yeah, you just mentioned that he traveled in France. How did in those final kind of years of his life he situate himself here?
I know that he had started spending summers here as early as 1878. And of course, I'm trying to remember, exactly who the connections were here, who brought him out to Montclair. But the thing is that Montclair was already accessible because there was a train that brought people here. So he came out for a number of visits, and then finally actually moved.
I think kind of this is sort of leading me to a question that I had, but essentially, like, it was interesting how you talked about obviously the train connection to Montclair, and certainly Montclair as we know it now in, urbanized northeastern New Jersey is not necessarily nature. Might not necessarily think as, this kind of sort of spread out metropolitan New York City metro area as the, this inspiring spiritual natural world that Inness saw. But obviously at the time it certainly was. And I think Montclair is really interesting because when I think of North Jersey and obviously I'm excluding like Western North Jersey out near like, where the ski mountain is and the Delaware Water Gap. But here, Montclair is interesting because there is still pockets of accessible, preserved nature. There's all of the walking and hiking trails and, over by like Eagle Rock and stuff. And obviously Montclair was a very different Montclair then, but it is interesting how you mentioned the train access from, I would imagine, New York City and stuff, and how Montclair probably at that time was an escape, a natural escape for people that was accessible. And I guess what I'm trying to get to is like the spirituality of Inness and his connection to nature and being able to tap into it and be a part of it and I guess present it in this like tangible way, despite being so closely connected and nearby to the quickly like industrializing vision of America that was quickly coming this way, if not already touching it.
Yeah. So it is interesting because Inness referred to his landscapes as civilized landscapes, so that there's always the presence of humanity in them. And that, of course, brings to mind Delaware Water Gap, of 1857, which has the train running throughout the landscape.
The cattle,
and then, of course, the landscape itself is very cultivated in terms of these, patches of farmland. So as you were talking about that, it did bring to mind a quote from someone that Montclair was referred to as half city and half country.
Oh, I've never heard of it that way, but it makes sense. Pivoting a little bit, I'm curious about, as an art scholar, as a curator, as just a art lover, was Inness somebody that you had an affinity for prior to your time here at MAM, or was this something that kind of got inherited with the job, this, being kind of this, I guess, I'm trying to figure out I can't find the right word, but I guess, the steward of his art and his memory, I guess, in a lot of ways, his vision.
Yeah, I mean, I would have to say that while I was aware of Inness, I didn't necessarily know that much about him, so that when I came to the museum in 1994, I mean, one of my first projects was inheriting a show on Inness that had begun under a previous curator, and then and it was a project that was being worked on in consultation with Frank Martucci, who at one time was on the museum's board, and he and his wife Catherine were the major patrons. I mean, they made the George Inness Gallery possible, and it opened in 2001. I mean, really thanks to their philanthropy and their generosity. So what happened is, at that time, that's really when I first started getting to know Frank Martucci, and the show was intended to feature the museum's collection and a few loans, and it was called George Inness, Presence of the Unseen.
Okay.
And it was based on a quotation from Inness, that the idea of the presence of the divine and the spiritual world, and feeling that presence in nature.
Yeah.
So it was a result of working on that show and writing a writing an essay for the catalog for that show, that I just started getting more and more involved with Inness. I guess I have to say also in what really became a kind of a friendship with Frank Martucci, which obviously intensified at the time that we were actually constructing the new gallery. So that's really the genesis of it.
Yeah. And I mean, I would dare to say, and I'm sure you'll be more humble about it, but I'll venture a little farther and say that we likely have the most extensive collection of Inness works in the world, in under one roof, and arguably I would say the most impressive. And, I guess my question is, prior to that 2001 show, how did we incorporate all of those works into the rotation, or did some of them only see the light of day on view for the first time when we put on this essentially ongoing permanent rotation?
So I guess I'd have to say it probably evolved in stages. And yes, Adrian Baxter Bell, by the way, agrees with you that we have the most significant collection, and that has a lot to do with the range and also the quality and condition of the paintings. They're in amazingly good condition. Some paintings and other collections have sometimes been over conserved or over restored. And ours really are, I'm happy to say, in very, very good condition. And in terms of the history of the representation, though, I guess I would have to say that it really was this recent installation in 2002 that we're now reinvigorating with this rotation. I mean, that was really the first time we showed a lot of Inness's work in the collection. I mean, it was the first time that we ever showed, 19 Inness works in our collection, because before then, the average from like 2001 onwards has really been more like only 9 or 10 paintings.
Mm-hmm.
So, yeah, that's a big difference.
Yeah, it is.
So it's exciting.
Yeah. I want to talk, because you alluded to it a little bit, and I think one of my favorite games that I play when I go visit museums is there an Inness and can I find it? And it's always accidental. It's never intentional. But I found myself when I was in DC at the, I guess the National Portrait Gallery, but the American Art Museum side of it. And I ran into an Inness or two. And that was the first time I say like discovering Innesses in the wild. And that was a very surreal moment, because I only know our collection and I've only come to, really have that experience with it, and to see other works of his outside of our collection that maybe show a different side of him is really interesting. I've also obviously ran into one of his works in the Met. I understand that there's one, I believe, at the Newport Art Museum. I don't know if that's on view, but I believe it might be actually right now with Donna Bassen's show. Mm-hmm. I know when I don't think this is in their collection, but I was doing some work for the museum and I had to go to Baton Rouge, and I visited LSU's museum, and they had the Bank of America collection there, and there was 2 Innesses there. So recently I've been coming, I think it's one of those things where you aren't looking for it, but unconsciously you're spotting it. Mm-hmm. And so I'm seeing more and more of his work, and it's been really interesting. And I guess one of my questions is like, because you kind of are like the central, not that you would consider yourself this, but you, in a lot of ways, like I said, are like a steward of his work and kind of are manning this immense collection of work. Do you find yourself talking with other curators at other institutions about the work of Inness? Like, how often are that dialogue happening?
Well, that's what's so much fun about working on new installations of the Inness Gallery. Like, for example, with one of the paintings that's going on view, Coast of Cornwall, painting that's actually a gift of Frank and Catherine Martucci. It is an enlarged version of a painting at a museum in Wisconsin, which I will admit I've never visited, called the Payne Art Center and Gardens. And so I reached out to them because I wanted information on that painting, and I also wanted a picture of it that would be is going to be part of the label for the rotation. And so that gave me a chance to think more about his practice, and the fact that they had the earlier painting that is a more literal rendition of this scene of crashing waves at the coast the coast of Cornwall, England. Yeah. And that one really featured this big boat grounded in the foreground. But then in the catalog raisonné for Inness, which is the study of all his complete works, they quoted a letter from Inness where he's saying, it's too much a picture of a boat. I'm going to enlarge it and give it more foreground. And so that's the painting that we have. But he just kept working on the painting and working on it until he died. And he, probably never finished it, although it all comes into interesting interpretations of the notion of finish. When is something finished? Because it's a wonderful, fully realized painting that gives you a glimpse into his creative process, and you can see underdrawing visible in parts of it. And it just... he basically says, I've never completed my art. I do not care about being a cake. I shall remain dough, which I just think is this awesome. Amazing quote. Like he was just constantly engaged with the creative process.
Yeah, constantly kneading, it's interesting. And I'm really interested in how you describe that work, because one of the questions that I had on my mind, and it was the way that Asif presented the gallery. Asif, my boss, the marketing director here, ma'am, I should probably contextualize that. But when he first walked me through the gallery when I was an intern on my first day, and we got to the collection of Inness works, he described it, and maybe you might refine this, but he described it as, obviously it's not like a linear timeline of his work, but you can kind of sort of see, sort of abstractly, how as he gets older and his work kind of progresses, it gets almost fuzzier or hazier or foggy, and it's not as fine, and there's more nuance to it, and leaves more to the imagination. And I was going to originally ask, like, could you talk about that transition of his work over time? But I'm interested in this specific work. Was that present over the timeline that he was essentially continuously working on this painting, or is it does it feel all in the same sort of style?
Well, that raises the issue, which I think is really important in his work, of, is the work of art unified? Is there a feeling of harmony? Does the overall composition work? And I think that in this case, well, basically all of his work, it usually there is that feeling of, it's by him. There's a sense of unity and harmony. Maybe he hasn't totally resolved all the areas of the composition, or he kept working on that. But and again, I think a lot of this comes through my conversation with Frank Martucci, where he was saying, he lived with this painting for years, and it had that feeling of harmony and unity to it. So it becomes, I think, very subjective as to how you even define that.
Yeah.
So, which, is interesting.
It
challenge.
Is. Yeah, absolutely. Aside from this work, what are some other things that an audience familiar with the Inness Gallery as we know it now can expect to see changed, I guess, as they kind of approach this new rotation?
So in some ways it will be pretty subtle, because there are 3 paintings that came down and 3 paintings that are going up. But I would say actually some of the frames are being conserved. So that's nice, in that they'll look a little brighter. Mm-hmm. And if we're lucky, there's one of the paintings we're hoping to actually be able to change the frame in time. So I guess the gallery will feel refreshed in that way. But really the main other element is certainly are the interviews with indigenous artists and a community member. Some thinking, of course, Nathan Young, and G. Peter Jemison as the artist, and then Betsy Richards, who's been a longtime visitor and friend to the museum and a longtime Montclair resident. So the variety of perspectives that people will be able to access and experience and listen to while they're in the gallery is just going to add a dimension to the gallery that we've never had before.
Yeah, and being, for me, because being a part of those conversations in just capturing them to have accessible for the audience to view while they're in the show was really special. And hearing the diversity of opinions, diversity of perspectives on what these works mean to them was really incredible. And how has it been for you, I guess, diving into this new rotation with Laura Allen, our Native American art curator, kind of at your side with this? Like, how has that dynamic been, trying to I guess present this show in this new light and I guess weave all of these narratives and stories and works together. Like it's a really, I would say, probably daunting but important and an exciting thing, you know?
Yeah. I mean, I think it was a combination of all of those, because at first, there were a lot of conversations about what does it mean to incorporate these perspectives and what's the best way. The process of collaboration and figuring out how to incorporate the indigenous perspectives, especially like what would be the means, was a conversation that took place over time, because for me, I mean, I wanted to have this happen, but I also didn't want to compromise what is the 19th century salon style installation where the paintings are hanging, there are no labels, and the labels are separate, they're in binders. So because at one point we were talking about, do we have an iPad that's like, right next to the paintings, or a label, or, we had to meet in the gallery and kind of figure out that we could have the iPad right next to the introductory text, and people would be able to easily find it, but it would still preserve the general feeling of the gallery. So I felt like we came to a really great balance, and I'm really pleased with that process, how it all worked out.
Yeah, I'm excited to see it, and I think our audience and of museum goers are too. I do want to be respectful of your time, and thank you again for chatting with me. I did, I guess, have one more thought, or I guess question, but kind of like what we said at the top of this, obviously Inness is an influential figure in the history of Montclair. But for those outside of the community, why is Inness one of the great American landscape painters that you could, and should frankly be in the conversation, I think is in the conversation, against someone like Winslow Homer, or even someone like, specifically like Sargent's landscapes that he's done? Like, why, I hate to say, like, why should people care about Inness, but like, what makes his work so influential in a way that like this should be a must-see artist for people, and an artist that should be like sought after?
Well, I think Inness's work looks and feels like nobody else's work. It's incredibly unique. It's so emotionally resonant and powerful. It draws you in, and I mean, it does require you to be willing to take a look at it for a while. I mean, it's not necessarily immediately glamorous, and it just, in other words, I guess it speaks kind of softly compared to some art. But once you allow yourself to take it in, it's just it's really emotionally powerful work. It's also, to me, it's very I don't know if peaceful is quite the word, because that doesn't, I think it doesn't encompass everything about Inness's work. It's just work that is, I guess, engaging on deeper levels than just, this is a pretty picture, although it can be incredibly beautiful too. But it just, you know what? It's kind of like a chapel for meditation is the way that a lot of people approached the experience of being in the gallery, which itself has a little barrel vault. I mean, it's really has a kind of intentionally a kind of chapel-like feeling to it. So, and I've always heard that it makes a lot of people just, I don't know, feel at peace.
It's meditative.
It has restorative qualities to it.
Yeah, and I think that certainly comes down to, the thematic nature of his work. I mean, it's immortalized on the walls. Knowledge bows to spirit, or spirit bows to knowledge.
Knowledge bows to spirit, right?
And when you're in there, it's the ceiling's a little low, like you said. It is, it does kind of feel like a temple in a way.
Yes.
And it feels like a temple to the natural world. It feels like a temple to nature, and it's really quite incredible. And I'm really excited to see, all of these new works.
Great.
Yeah.
Good.
Well, thank you again, Gail.
Sure.
I really appreciate it. This has been so fun.
Good.
All right.
All right.
Thanks so much for sticking around to the end of this episode. We're going to be talking to Adrienne Baxter Bell, a scholar, historian, author, professor on all things George Inness. I'm really excited for that conversation, so stay tuned. It should be coming somewhere near the middle of the month, and if you end up liking all of this kind of storytelling around George Inness and the episode more focused on his history to come with Adrienne, then you can actually catch a live in-person Galen lecture here at the Montclair Art Museum featuring Adrienne Baxter Bell, artist Donna Basson, and artist Nathan Young. They're going to be talking broadly about the influence of George Inness on Nathan as an indigenous artist, Donna as an environmental focused artist, and obviously Adrienne Baxter Bell as the historical kind of context provider and scholar. So I think it's going to be a really great conversation. You can find tickets right now on the Montclair Art Museum's website. That's just www.montclairartmuseum.org. Thanks so much for sticking around to the end of this episode. I will talk to you next Wednesday at 10 a.m. Bye. Happy birthday to you. Happy birthday to you. Happy birthday, George Inness. Happy birthday to you. Let's see if I keep that in.